Good morning everyone, my name is Jim Hunt, I'm one of the nurse educators at Insight and I'd like to welcome you to another Insight APSAD seminar. To start with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to extend that welcome and respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that might be joining us in the room or on webinar land. So welcome and thank you for coming. Today it gives me great pleasure to introduce a speaker that's flown up from Sydney to join us, Associate Professor Garrett Prestage, who's come from the Kirby Institute in Sydney, and he's going to give us a presentation on sex, drugs and men in flux. So please welcome Garrett to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. But how do I start it? Oh, it's already in the thing, right. So thank you for inviting me. It was supposed to be Mo, my PhD student, but he's in the final throes of his PhD submission, so he asked me to do this instead, and I was very happy to do so. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about sex, drugs and men in flux. Flux is the study that I'll be primarily talking to you about. And what we're doing is presenting some key findings from the study. Now, just before I do start, I know that ordinarily you leave questions to the end, but if there are points of confusion, clarification or something, then please do stop me and ask about that. So just as some background, why is it that we should be interested in researching drug use among gay and bisexual men? These are taken from the National Household Survey, about 20,000 people, comparing heterosexual respondents with homosexual respondents, men only. And you can see that for all the drug categories, gay men use drugs at extraordinarily higher rates than in the general population. The other reason why we're interested in this is over a decade ago we had a cohort study of gay and bisexual men that was a major study and it looked at predictors of HIV infection in the cohort. And of course there were all the other things that we're looking at around sexual behaviour and stuff, but we looked specifically at the drug use stuff, and what we found was that men who used methamphetamine were almost 2 times as likely to seroconvert. Men who used erectile dysfunction medications, and I'll come back to those later on, because you might be wondering why those, why Viagra, but 4 times more likely to seroconvert. And those who used both, and this is the key thing, those who used both were 8 times more likely to seroconvert. So that meant that it was a really important issue for us at the Kirby Institute, who are looking at issues around HIV. So that led us to setting up the Flux study. The name means Following Lives Undergoing Change. This is the team of investigators and staff working on the study. It was funded by the Australian Research Council and a small amount of funds specifically from Gilead for work that we were doing in 2018. So the study is a prospective observational study of licit and illicit drug use among gay and bisexual men. The primary purpose of the study was in fact to look at the factors that were associated with the initiation of drugs. So what predicted commencement of drug use among gay and bisexual men? A lot of other things as well, of course, but that was the main thing that was funded to do. Now, we had to do this with relatively limited funds. We didn't get anywhere near what we needed to do this, to run a national cohort study. And fortunately, we had Mo, who was supposed to be here, but Mo had some really useful skills in managing the study. And primarily in that was the development of an online cohort management system, which is called FAME, originally called FAME because it was the Flux Automated Management E-System. It's now the follow-up Automated Management E-System because it's used in a number of different studies. What this did was it automated the process for running a cohort study. And that's really important when you've got limited funds. But it's also really important just in managing a cohort generally. So, for example, with this, we have participants 1 and 2 at baseline. And at their baseline, they are asked whether or not they used or didn't use particular drugs. And so in number 1, he used them, and number 2, he didn't use them. Then what happens is at follow-up, they change their behaviour, right? So then that allows us to ask a whole series of other questions because what they responded to at baseline is automatically fed through to the follow-up questionnaire. Now that's a remarkable thing that's really valuable because it allows you to tailor questionnaires specifically to the person's own history. The other amazing thing that this system has done is it automates the actual follow-up process. So when their time is due for their follow-up rounds, which is automatically plugged into the system, so you tell the system what the regularity of follow-up is, and when their follow-up is due, they're then sent automatically an email reminding them and a text message, an SMS message, automatically, and when they click on it, it automatically goes to their own tailored survey. It's pretty amazing. But what that allowed us to do is to run the study on the back of an oily rag. So very quickly, there are almost 4,000 men in the cohort, which is a really large amount, and probably wouldn't have been manageable if it wasn't for the system. The participants' mean age was 31, highly educated, mostly gay, and 3/4 HIV negative, and just under 8% HIV positive. That's very typical of a sample of gay men in Australia. Nothing unusual about them at all, other than, it's not here unfortunately, but other than there's actually a very large proportion of younger men. The reason that there's a large proportion of younger men is mostly because we specifically targeted younger men. Remember, we were looking at what are the factors that lead to initiation of drug use. So we had to catch people before they started drug use. So that's why we targeted young men especially, although not entirely. Mostly they came through Facebook and other online media. Won't worry about that too much. But let's turn to the primary thing that we're here about, which is the drug use. And these are the baseline prevalences of drug use. The blue is whether or not they've ever used those drugs, and the whatever colour that is that they've used it in the previous 6 months. The rates are very, very high, and those who know the prevalences in the general population would see that quite well. Yeah. And then this is a busy slide, don't worry about it. It shows the frequency of each drug type. The only thing that you really need to take notice of is that the dark blue at the bottom is that they've used it once or twice in the previous 6 months. So you can see that for pretty much every drug, most of their use is occasional, very occasional. There are two main exceptions to that. Amyl nitrate on the left, where you can see that fully half of them have used more than incidentally, And the other one is crystal methamphetamine. So those who used crystal also tended to use it. There was more of them used it more than incidentally. And this is the initiation of drug use. This is the 12-month incidence. So this is the kind of data that really haven't been seen anywhere else. Now, those of you who know anything about incidence data will probably find this astonishing. So if you look at the amyl nitrate on the left, that's over 10% of men who were not using amyl nitrates at baseline, then 12 months later had initiated use of amyl. That's probably not too surprising because amyl nitrate is fairly commonly used and in dance cultures and blah. So it's not a huge thing. But then even if you look at crystal meth, which is here, so even with the crystal meth, it's around about just under 3%. So over a 12-month period, 3% of men who were not using crystal meth had initiated it. If you think about it, that's pretty extraordinary. So in terms of what we were setting out to do, we certainly captured the right sample. Now this is by age, and what you can see is that the initiation mostly happened among younger men. That's what you would expect, of course. Younger men are least likely to ever use, so therefore. But there are two exceptions to this. And unfortunately, this is a really busy slide, and I just realised yesterday that this doesn't have the second slide, that only has the two highlighted that I want to show you. So you're going to have to follow this a little bit. So there's GHB is this purple line there, and crystal is this red line. Okay, if you look at them, you'll see that they're actually not changing. So that means that men who initiate either GHB or crystal meth can be pretty much of any age. So they initiate it through their lives. It's not something that's peculiar to being initiated during their younger years. Now the other thing here is the age at which they first used drugs. And if you think back to what I just showed you there, now where's the... So it's the third column that shows you the average age at which they commenced using those drugs. Now, those of you who have had experience with drug use data and looked at age of first drug use in the general population, you'll probably notice that these ages are actually quite high, because in the general population they tend to be in the teens. So what it tells you is that while the rates of use are very high among gay men, they actually commence using at a later date. And that's especially the case for drugs like crystal, which is 32, and almost the same for GHB. So quite late that they commence those drugs, which explains that flat line in the previous graph. So we also include some qualitative material in the study. We asked men to write out their reasons for use, non-use, and a whole lot of other things. Here are some quotes. "A friend introduced me to it and I love the crazy intensity of the false connection during sex where nothing else matters, and I love the sudden abrupt wakefulness and awareness of how crazy it was when it was over." And then the next man says, new group situations, so new groups of friends, more socially acceptable, less inhibitions, trusted the people more. And then finally, one guy I had sex with offered it and I thought, you only live once. So the reason we put these three quotes, and this is not atypical at all, is because they speak to social connectedness. They speak to connections as being one of the primary things for initiation of drug use. And we'll come back to this as we see through the data. So this is the acceptability among their gay friends of using party drugs in this case. And so 2/3 of the men who reported recent use versus 1 in 5 of those who reported no use were reporting that it was acceptable among their friends to use those drugs. So it's not really surprising. Accepting attitudes towards party drug use with gay friends was associated with, obviously, with using the drugs themselves, very highly associated, but also with a stronger connection to gay community. So just being socially connected to other gay men was more likely to lead to that sort of acceptability around drug use. We asked men how they get their drugs. First off, we asked them how difficult it was to obtain their drugs, and you can see most of them found it pretty damned easy to get them. Really, well over half, not at all difficult, and another third, only slightly difficult. Then asking them why they were using it, and nearly half of the men who used crystal said that they just used it because it was available. And about 15% of the men who used G. And where did they get it? And you can see that while a quarter of them got it through a dealer, a half of them got it through friends. So again, it sort of speaks to not just social connectedness, but also availability. This is basically the same thing, we don't need to. So, in terms of injecting behaviours, 1 in 20 of the men in Flux have reported recent injecting. And in the 2017 round, there were 100 men who reported injecting. Now, 88 of those men never shared needles, and 12 did, at least once. But interestingly, of the 12 who shared needles, 5, now, regardless of the effectiveness or not, 5 of those men always sterilised their needles. And also, when you look more closely at the 12 men who shared, 6 of them were taking PrEP, so that's pre-exposure prophylaxis that prevents HIV, and 6 were HIV positive and on treatment. So that's all 12. And of the 6 positive men who were on treatment, 5 of them were undetectable. So in terms of HIV transmission, there's pretty much next to no evidence of potential risk in terms of the injecting. That's just HIV transmission. But it's certainly an interesting point because I don't know if you're aware of the surveillance data, but of course, apart from the overwhelming numbers that are gay men, there's a small category of men for whom HIV infection is cited to be either their sexual behaviour or injecting drug use. But these data would suggest that it's probably the sex, not the drugs, not the injecting. How did they get their injecting equipment? Just under half of them through an NSP. But if you look down the list, then you'll see that there's 37% who also get it through an NSP vending machine. So NSPs account for a lot of the equipment. But then you look through it and you see sex partners 39%, 30% from friends, So quite a few are getting it through their social connections as well. So if we obviously where there's a lot of polydrug use in the cohort. So we've done a latent class analysis, and essentially what that's told us is not surprising, but it's certainly interesting. It comes up with 5 different groupings of men who are using drugs. Group A on the left are men who really use either no drugs or minimally use, and mostly restricted to drugs like amyl nitrate and marijuana, so not very druggy at all. Then the second group are men who just use the licit drugs, the legal drugs, although it's questionable about the legality of amyl nitrate at the moment, but putting that aside, just the licit drugs that are just specifically for sex. So that's the Viagra type drugs as well as the amyl nitrate. And then group C is those who use party drugs generally. So the ecstasy, marijuana, cocaine, speed, LSD. This is the group that I would say looks most like drug use among young people in the population generally. They're just partiers. Yep. Then group D are those who specifically use chemsex drugs. So they're using the drugs using drugs that are used primarily for sex. So the Viagra type drugs, crystal, GHB, amyl nitrate. They're the main drugs that they're in that group. Then the final group, the ones that I just say they just use everything. I don't remember the proportion. Oh, the proportions are here, yeah. So, of course, most people are in the minimal drug use, but that group that uses everything, there's 6%. So when we look at the characteristics of those groups, what we see, I think the important points to note are, if we look at the second group and the fourth group, which is the licit sex drugs group and the chemsex drugs group, because they're the two that are most clearly, apart from those who use everything, of course, the most clearly related to that issue around the interconnection between drugs and sex. If you look down at number of partners, for example, what you see is that the men who use the licit drugs, around 33 partners in the previous 6 months, and the men who use chemsex drugs, around 38, much higher than the other groups. Similarly, if you look down the list and you see using drugs for sex, the bottom line, the licit sex drugs, 85%, and the chemsex drugs, 92%. It's really clear. They're very similar groups. It's just that one group is not actually using illicit drugs, they're just using the legal ones. So there's probably just a clear decision being made about the kind of drugs that they'll use, but they're still doing it in the same context of sex, drugs and partying. So turning specifically to chemsex, almost 2/3 of the men who use drugs reported using drugs for sex, and about 40% for group sex. Now, that's clearly not, much of that is probably, or is, very occasional use. So not all of those men are doing what we've defined as chemsex, but it tells you that a big motivation for drug use among gay men is in fact sexual enhancement, sexual pleasure. Now, I should just say that we focus, if you remember right back to the start, I told you about the erectile dysfunction medication and methamphetamine use. and they're predictors, being predictors of HIV infection. So those are two drugs that we've really focused on a great deal because of that. But we've also added into that some consideration around amyl nitrate use, primarily because of the recent issues around it, but also because it is part of the chemsex context, and GHB. GHB because we've seen it as being a drug that's been increasing and is clearly related to it as well, to chemsex as well. But this is methamphetamine specifically, and what it's looking at is different indicators of risk, HIV risk in this case, but it could be other. I mean, STI risk would apply equally. On the left, the three columns are men who did not use meth. In the middle are men who had used methamphetamine in the past but not recently, and on the right, those who've used it recently. And what you can see, the orangey brown colour is condomless sex with casual partners. The green colour is group sex, and the purple colour is having more than 10 partners in the previous 6 months. What you can see is that there's a clear relationship. Any use, and especially recent use, much more likely to be associated with higher risk behaviours. Well, I use the word risk, but we'll see in a moment why that's actually complicated. And we also asked men about their reasons for using both crystal and GHB. And essentially, if you look down the list, what you see down the bottom, the ones that are most common, are for better sex and for a party and play session, party and play being a sex session. So clearly they're the most common reasons. They're not the only reasons, but they're the most common reasons that men use the drugs. So I've briefly touched on PrEP just before, but just so that everybody's on board. So Truvada, used as PrEP, virtually eliminates the possibility of HIV transmission. And what we're looking at in the next few slides is how that fits with the men who are engaging in chemsex. And I think you'll find this surprising. So this is the predictors of crystal methamphetamine initiation. And we're looking at what they were doing at baseline that might have predicted their initiation of crystal. And there's only one thing that's significantly associated with it, and that's being socially engaged with other gay men who use crystal. That's not surprising, but it's an important finding nonetheless, because I didn't mention at the start, there are in fact no other cohort studies of gay and bisexual men using drugs. So it's important to be able to actually quantify this. However, on this slide we're looking at what they were doing at follow-up when they initiated crystal. And you can see that it's changed enormously. Suddenly they're much more likely to be engaging in various activities that have previously been defined as risk behaviours, condomless sex obviously, group sex, and more sexual partners, that's right. What's also really interesting though is, and this is actually 2017 data, it's 2018 data, it's even more striking. What's really interesting is that they're much more likely to have initiated PrEP. So those who initiated crystal methamphetamine were also more likely to initiate PrEP. So keep that in mind for the moment. This is looking at methamphetamine use in 2018. And it's no crystal use versus recent crystal use. And so what we see is that those who are more socially connected to other gay men, those who have more partners, are more likely to be using crystal. That's sort of reinforces what we've seen before. So it speaks to social connectedness. But biomedically protected condomless anal intercourse with casual partners. So if they engage in condomless sex with casual partners, is it protected either by PrEP or by a positive man being on treatment and having undetectable viral load? And that is significantly associated with recent crystal use. And not just a little bit, they're twice as likely. Now, if we step back a little bit, because this all sounds a little bit general, but if we look more specifically at those men who have recently used crystal, but at a rate that's less than monthly, so pretty incidentally, versus the men who have used crystal at least monthly or more. And there what we see is something slightly different. There what we find, yes, the men who are more socially connected to gay men are more likely to use more frequently. Yes, that's true. But also they're more likely to be experiencing depression. So I'll come back to this in a little bit, but there's clearly a difference between just using and using frequently. They're not necessarily the same thing. And remember, most of the use is occasional, not regular. Now, this is changes in behaviours over time. So, Truvada who's PrEP, the blue line, and you can see that that's increased over time. That's men who use Truvada and weren't using either methamphetamine or Viagra, just Truvada. That's increased enormously over time. Again, if you add the 2018 data, it's even more striking. The red line is men who used methamphetamine and Viagra together, the two key indicators of HIV infection that we've seen before. Yeah? And so you look at that red line, and it's actually decreasing. Why is it decreasing? Because of the purple line, which is the men who are adding Truvada to the mix. So what we're calling is MTV. And you can see that that's increasing pretty much at the same rate as the men who use just methamphetamine and Viagra alone is decreasing. So what's happening is that they're integrating PrEP into their drug use regimen, which is a pretty important thing to think about when most of the descriptions around methamphetamine users particularly is of chaos. So when we look at PrEP use, what's associated with PrEP use among the chemsex players, again, the same story, social connectedness to gay men, having more partners, having condomless sex. So those things are not surprising. That's what you would sort of expect, except for that it's really important to remember all the time how important this social connectedness to other gay men is for pretty much everything that we've talked about. So, just quickly turning to amyl nitrate. I'll do the bottom part first. I'll do the top. Sorry. So we're looking at men who never used amyl on the left, used it in the past but not recently, used it less than monthly in the past 6 months, at least monthly, and at least weekly. Okay, so an increasing frequency in those columns. And if you look at the first part, which is the PrEP use, what you see is that it's not just crystal, but also for the amyl users, they're much more likely to be using PrEP than the men who didn't use amyl. And then if we look at the bottom line, the very bottom line, what that is the proportion of those men who are engaging in receptive, condomless anal intercourse with casual partners, which is the highest risk category that you can be in ordinarily. But the proportion of those men who are protected by PrEP. And what you see is that the increasing frequency of amyl, the much more likely they are to be actually using PrEP to protect themselves if they're engaging in condomless receptive sex. To the point that it's almost 90% of those who use it weekly. So risk is rapidly being taken out of the profile in terms of HIV here. Now, just to go back to that, to trying to not generalise too much and look at more specifics. So this is recent drug use and mental health. The first thing that you'll notice is that for all the illicit drugs, except for one, for all the illicit drugs, there was no relationship between anxiety and depression and use of those drugs. None. Now that will surprise people. The only exception is GHB, where they were actually a little less anxious. But if you go down below the line to the licit drugs, the legal drugs, no relationship with alcohol, but tobacco, yeah, they're much more likely to be anxious and depressed. And if they're using Viagra, then they're probably a little less anxious. So what does that say? What does that mean? It's hard to figure out given what most people's expectations are. But if we look in a little more detail, and we look at the issue of crystal dependence. Now, if you recall, we saw earlier something around frequency of use, and here, well, and we also know that the frequency of use is highly associated with dependence. So when we're looking at men who used crystal in the previous 6 months, and we're looking at the men who had no evidence of dependence versus the men who were dependent users, you see a really strong association between anxiety and depression and dependence. So again, it's not just any use that's the issue, it's the dependent use that matters. On the previous slide, what we saw was no relationship, and that probably is a reasonable reflection of the experience for most men. But for those, the minority who are frequent and dependent users, there are clearly mental health issues going on. So, what's the time? So just quickly looking at some of the consequences of drug and alcohol use. Basically what this tells us is that, yes, men report harms from their drug use. Not a lot, but they're there. But the light blue down the bottom are the much more positive sort of experiences. And so they're very commonly telling us that. The one exception is that one where it says had unsafe sex. But of course, given what we now know about how you define that, it's sort of hard to know what that actually means. Because typically it's had a very particular meaning for gay men, the concept of unsafe. And so they're probably responding to that in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect actual risk. And yes, there are reports of overdose, and actually at reasonably high rates. So all of those other experiences don't discount the fact that there are real risks involved here. So 6% report that of the drug users report that they've ever overdosed. So that's a lot. And almost 3% more than once. And particularly for methamphetamine users, GHB users, and injecting drug users, it's about a third of men, a third of those users who ever report overdose. But again, it's really important to note that the main factor that's associated with overdose was frequency of use. So again, it comes back to, it's not just a general issue around problematics, it's specific to the frequent and dependent users. And we need to think that through when we're thinking about drug use in general among gay men. Probably generally, but this is what I know. We asked the men about their perception of their own drug use, whether or not we asked them to validate measures around dependence, but we also asked them about their perception of their drug use and whether or not they considered it problematic. About just under 16% considered that their own drug use was problematic, which is, given what we've seen in terms of like the frequency of use and stuff, that makes sense, that you would get that small minority, but they clearly would be in a problematic situation. But for the crystal methamphetamine users, it's 44% who consider their use problematic. So crystal meth is not just the standard drug. And so there are a much higher proportion of men who are using crystal who get into trouble. It's not to say that it's all problematic, of course, at all. Clearly the majority is not, but there's a significant minority for whom it is. I won't go through most of this. I don't know if you're all aware about the current TGA inquiries into amyl nitrate, or alkyl nitrate, sorry. But because of that, we asked some specific questions around it. Amyl nitrate is used among gay men primarily for two reasons. As a general buzz, quick buzz, often when partying. And you can see in the reasons cited, a third of them say, yeah, that's what I use it for. But the other reason is for sex, and it's specifically because it's a muscle relaxant and it makes it easier for penetration during anal sex. And you can see there's 2/3 of them report that they use it because it's easier to get fucked that way. So we asked them specifically, what would they do if the regulations were changed and it was either banned or difficult to get? Only 16% said they'd stop using it. 2/3 said that they'd find some other way to buy it. Over half that they'd buy it online. So changing the regulations is just going to criminalise them. It's not going to actually stop them. And given that it actually does help during sex, it would probably be actually harmful. We asked them about their use of services. I've got to remember this because I keep getting confused with this. Right. It takes me a while to get my head around this particular slide for some reason. So what we're looking at here is the relationship between various characteristics and whether or not they considered their use as problematic. And what we can see is that a large proportion of the HIV positive men were likely to consider their use problematic. And men the men who have more friends who use drugs also are more likely to consider their use problematic. That's hard to judge whether that means that it's because they have lots of friends or because their friends have influenced them to perceive that they're... So it's hard to get your head around that one. However, we asked them about their comfort in using alcohol and other drug services. And there are two things... Essentially what they say is that clinical services are the ones that they are most likely to consider problematic. The men who... Sorry, I got that completely wrong. That the men who consider their drug use problematic are most likely to feel comfortable using the clinical services. Not the traditional AOD services. They're more likely to feel less comfortable with those than they are with typical clinical services, doctors, psychologists, counsellors. And this makes a little more sense when we look at this, and I think here it's, unfortunately, so I have to point it out to you, but essentially what it's, because we didn't really explore this in a lot of detail, we haven't got a lot of the data that I would like on this, but essentially what it's saying is that if they're going to be looking for information about drug use to help them, then they're more likely to be going to gay services and HIV services than they are to typical AOD services. So that's an important point. And unfortunately, most of the gay and HIV services are not necessarily funded sufficiently to cater to those kinds of issues. So finally, I want to leave you with this this quote from one of our amazingly articulate participants, because I think it really sums up a lot of the issues. While not all risks can be managed, especially with the lack of legality and regulation being what I view as the primary reason for the riskiness, by the combination of a reliable source, sensible discussion or rules about frequency and quantity of use, and a decent friendship network to keep an eye on each other, I've had many fabulous experiences on drugs and have some strong friendships that effectively started with a mutual shared drug experience. It's not all about wild partying and promiscuous sex, although those can be fun both with and without drugs. And I think that really sums up the message that we're getting through these data, is that it has to be contextualised. You have to understand what it's for, and you have to understand what kinds of protections are necessarily they're putting in place or not, before you make a decision about what's appropriate to this particular man and to thinking about gay men in general. Now that's all of the, I won't go through the summary, but just to give you finally where we're at the moment. Flux has been hasn't had funds for a couple of years, but we're nonetheless able to maintain the cohort through the rest of this year. It has expanded. There's now a Flux New Zealand, and there's going to be a Flux for lesbian, bisexual and queer women. And they are running separately but also parallel to the main Flux cohort. And the FAME system, the online system that I talked about at the start, that automatically and remotely maintains all of these cohorts, also is now maintaining 3 national and international cohort studies, an STI prophylaxis clinical study, it essentially can be tailored to all kinds of study aims. And I think that's it. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Garrett, for a very interesting presentation. I actually have a couple of questions quickly myself. One is the lesbian and gay women. Is that an Australian Flux study?
Yes.
That's going to be. And the other question I have is, it's really interesting to see the challenge between what a lot of people's ideas around that cohort might be with their drug use and actually the actual risks that are there, which seems to be greatly minimised. Do you think that's through accessing services, through word of mouth, through themselves, that information is being shared about PrEP and the reduction of risks associated?
I think it's actually really simple. What we're seeing in the data is that the men who engage in chemsex, so the men who previously would have been at highest risk of HIV, are also highly immersed in gay culture, highly immersed in the gay community, so therefore highly connected to gay community. And that's where PrEP has been targeted. So it makes absolute sense. And of course, they're not stupid. They can make the connection. They know that their behaviour puts them at risk, and so therefore they take PrEP.
Any other questions in the room?
No, I have some online. Oh, did I see a hand go up? No?
I have some online. So I know that you had clarification. I think there was 1 of your cohort were identified as Indigenous. Do you have any data around culturally and linguistically diverse amongst that study?
Well, yeah, we collect those data. We haven't really pulled it out separately. We've had a look at it, and primarily we've looked at it. First off, the numbers of Indigenous men are small, so it's not easy to do a lot with them. My recollection is that there's about 80 men, so it's possible to do some analysis, but not a lot. My recollection when we've had a look has been that they don't look particularly different to the rest of the men. That's not unusual in gay samples. It's often the case that there's not a great deal of difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous men within gay samples. The other group that we've had a brief look at is Asian men who are of Asian background, and specifically we've looked at them in relation to PrEP use, and that was primarily because there was an issue at least a year ago around Asian-born men and access to PrEP in general, and so we wanted to see whether or not that applied within the cohort, and it didn't. They seem to be pretty much like the rest of the sample as well. I'm not saying that is absolutely the case for both of those, but that's as much as I can say about it.
Thank you. And the other question I had was, when you're identifying somebody with crystal dependence, is that self-reported, or how are you measuring that?
Well, actually both. We asked them about their dependence, and that was some of the data I reported, but we also asked the validated measure, which is I can't remember the name of the measure, but it's a validated measure. So we're using both of those, and obviously they're both highly correlated, but interestingly, they're more likely to report themselves as being dependent than the validated measure indicates that they are. So we take the more conservative approach.
The final question I have is a short question. It says, how is PrEP funded? Which is a slight side thing, I guess. Is that, it doesn't say whether the individuals or as a whole. What can you say?
Well, PrEP is on the PBS, and so they can obtain it by getting a prescription from their doctor and going and buying it at the chemist, or they can buy it online.
Thank you, Garrett. Any questions in the room before I ask for a thank you? No, in which case, can you thank Garrett for his presentation today? Thank you.